announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
No warning shots, no alarms broadcast to the world. Just a sudden shift in the balance beneath the waves as the carrier strike group centered on USS Abraham Lincoln moved through what was supposed to be a routine patrol. The sea looked calm, the sky was quiet. But deep below the surface, something had already gone wrong. For weeks, intelligence analysts had whispered about unusual submarine activity tied to Venezuela. Signals that didn't match known exercises. Acoustic signatures that appeared once, vanished, then returned closer. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Unofficially, every sonar operator in the task force knew they were being watched. A brief, distorted return on sonar. Too slow for a whale. Too controlled to be debris. The kind of sound that makes a combat information center fall silent. Within seconds, escort ships altered course, helicopters lifted into the air, and the carrier's defensive screen tightened. No one spoke the word attack, but every action said the same thing. Some accounts claim a torpedo solution was achieved. Others insist it was a shadow maneuver, a calculated demonstration rather than a strike. What is known is that for the next 51 minutes, the carrier group operated under near total operational silence. No transmissions, no public alerts, just steel hulls cutting through dark water while unseen adversaries moved below. According to leaked fragments of after-action reports, at least 2 unidentified submarines were tracked at different depths, using staggered movement to confuse detection. One disappeared entirely. The other lingered just long enough to force a decision that would never be acknowledged on the record. Above the surface, sailors saw nothing. Below it, every second stretched. Anti-submarine aircraft dropped sensors. Destroyers ran aggressive search patterns. The carrier itself adjusted speed and heading, a floating city maneuvering as if it were a chess piece under threat. The contacts faded. The sensors went quiet. The ocean returned to stillness. No explosions were reported, no wreckage surfaced. No official statements followed. The Gulf, as one unnamed officer later described it, went completely silent, like it was holding its breath. Was this a failed attack? A warning? A message sent not with words but with proximity and timing? Or was it something even more dangerous? A rehearsal for a conflict that hasn't yet been admitted? What makes this incident so unsettling isn't what we know, but what we don't. In an era where every missile launch is filmed and every strike analyzed in real time, this confrontation left almost no trace. Just fragments, rumors, and a single, chilling timestamp. Tonight, we're reconstructing what may have happened during those 51 minutes beneath the surface. The maneuvers, the risks, and the silent decisions that could have changed everything. And almost did. The night began like dozens of others before it, with the carrier strike group built around USS Abraham Lincoln moving steadily through warm, dark waters under strict operational discipline. The time was approaching early evening, just after sunset, when the sea often becomes most deceptive. On the surface, conditions were ideal. Low swell, light winds, clear visibility, and minimal civilian traffic. For the crew, it was classified as a routine patrol phase. But routine meant something very different inside a combat-ready naval formation. The carrier was not alone. Surrounding it in a wide, carefully calculated perimeter were guided missile destroyers and cruisers tasked with air defense, missile interception, and most critically, anti-submarine warfare. These ships moved in layered patterns, constantly adjusting distance and speed to avoid predictability. Beneath the formation, sonar arrays listened continuously, separating biological noise from mechanical signatures. Above, radar systems scanned the sky while helicopters stood ready on deck, rotors folded, crews waiting for a signal that might never come, or might come without warning. Officially, the strike group was conducting freedom of navigation operations and regional deterrence patrols. Unofficially, the tension level had been quietly raised days earlier. Intelligence briefings had included vague but concerning references to increased underwater activity in the region. Nothing actionable, nothing that could be cited publicly, but enough to prompt commanders to tighten procedures. Sonar operators were instructed to treat ambiguous contacts with greater scrutiny. Escort vessels were authorized to maneuver more aggressively than usual. The carrier itself maintained a slightly altered course profile, subtle enough to appear normal to any observer, but deliberate in its unpredictability. Life aboard the carrier continued in parallel worlds. On the flight deck, crews completed the last recovery cycle of the day, securing aircraft as daylight faded. Below decks, thousands of sailors moved through narrow corridors, eating, resting, or standing watch. In the Combat Information Center, however, the atmosphere was different. Lights were dimmed, voices measured, every screen monitored with intent. No one expected an incident, but no one dismissed the possibility either. One factor that added quiet pressure was timing. The patrol coincided with a window when regional naval exercises were known to occur, creating a dense acoustic environment underwater. This made sonar interpretation more difficult, increasing the risk of both false positives and missed detections. According to later accounts, one destroyer on the outer screen briefly flagged a low-confidence contact earlier in the evening, only for it to dissolve into background noise. The report was logged, not escalated, but it lingered in memory. The carrier group's speed remained moderate, fast enough to complicate submarine targeting solutions, but slow enough to conserve fuel and maintain formation integrity. Aircraft were secured, but several anti-submarine helicopters remained on short standby, crews already suited up. This posture suggested readiness without alarm, a balance U.S. naval doctrine emphasizes in contested waters. As the clock edged closer to 6:47 p.m., there were no alarms, no sudden maneuvers, no visible signs that anything was about to change. Yet beneath the surface, the environment was far from empty. Thermal layers shifted with the cooling evening water, bending sound waves in unpredictable ways. For submarines, real or hypothetical, these conditions offered both opportunity and risk. In hindsight, analysts would point to this moment as the calm before a confrontation that may or may not have crossed the line into open combat. At the time, it felt like just another night at sea. The kind that passes quietly, logged and forgotten. The kind where nothing happens, until suddenly, it does. The first indication that the situation was changing did not arrive dramatically. There was no single alarm or flashing warning, just a subtle irregularity in the acoustic picture that seasoned sonar operators had learned never to ignore. Deep below the carrier strike group centered on USS Abraham Lincoln, passive sonar arrays picked up a faint, intermittent sound that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the sea. It was not loud, and it was not constant, but it had structure. That alone was enough to raise attention. At first, the contact was classified as possible, biologic, or unknown. Whales, large fish, even distant merchant traffic can produce misleading signatures, especially in warm waters where thermal layers distort sound. But this contact behaved differently. It appeared briefly, vanished, then re-emerged minutes later at a slightly altered bearing. That pattern suggested controlled movement rather than drifting noise. The operator logged the contact again, this time with a higher confidence rating, and passed it up the chain. Within moments, other ships in the screen were quietly asked to review their own acoustic data. No one announced a threat, but information began to flow faster. A second destroyer reported a weak but matching frequency band, detected at a different depth. Individually, neither contact would have triggered action. Together, they suggested something was maneuvering deliberately beneath the formation. Anti-submarine warfare is a discipline built on uncertainty. Submarines are designed to be invisible, and modern naval doctrine assumes that the first clear detection often comes late. For this reason, the response was cautious rather than aggressive. Active sonar, which could reveal the group's position, was held in reserve. Instead, passive systems were retuned, filters adjusted, and operators instructed to widen their search parameters. Every sound was re-examined, stripped of background clutter, and compared against known acoustic libraries. As the minutes passed, the picture grew more complex. The original contact appeared to split, or at least give the impression of doing so. One acoustic trace faded toward deeper water, while another lingered at a shallower depth. This could have been an illusion created by thermal layering, but it also matched known submarine tactics designed to confuse tracking efforts. The possibility of more than one platform was now quietly acknowledged in the Combat Information Center. Above the surface, nothing changed visually. The carrier maintained course and speed, its massive hull cutting smoothly through calm water. To an outside observer, the formation looked relaxed. Below the surface, however, calculations were being made continuously. Estimated speeds, turning radii, potential weapon ranges. None of these were spoken aloud, but they informed every decision. At this stage, the threat was still unconfirmed. There was no proof of hostile intent, only presence. International waters allow for shadowing, and submarines often trail surface groups for intelligence-gathering purposes. What made this situation different was proximity. One of the contacts, according to later reconstructed timelines, closed to a distance that forced planners to consider worst-case scenarios. Even without weapons in the water, distance alone can be a message. Helicopter crews were brought to immediate readiness. Sonobuoys were staged for rapid deployment, though none were released yet. The strike group commander faced a familiar dilemma: act too early and risk escalation, or wait too long and surrender the initiative. The decision for now was to watch and listen. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, one contact vanished completely. No gradual fade, no drift, just gone. The second remained, faint but steady, holding position just outside the most comfortable safety margin. Whether this disappearance was the result of a sharp maneuver, a descent into a deeper thermal layer, or something more deliberate, no one could say with certainty. What was clear was that the ocean around the carrier group was no longer empty. The idea of isolation vanished, replaced by the awareness of unseen movement in 3 dimensions. From that moment on, the patrol was no longer routine. It had become a silent contest of detection, patience, and restraint, with both sides fully aware that a single misstep could turn shadows into weapons. Once the presence beneath the surface could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the situation crossed an invisible threshold. What followed was not a sudden explosion of action, but a controlled escalation shaped by doctrine, experience, and restraint. The carrier strike group, centered on USS Abraham Lincoln, shifted into a posture that balanced readiness with ambiguity. Orders were transmitted using brief, coded phrases, minimizing emissions while ensuring every unit understood its role. Courses were adjusted incrementally, not enough to appear reactive, but sufficient to complicate any predictive targeting from below. The first deliberate move came from the escorts. Without activating full active sonar, one destroyer altered speed sharply, executing a maneuver designed to force a submerged contact to react. Submarines rely on predicting surface ship movement. Unpredictability degrades that advantage. Almost immediately, analysts noticed a change in the acoustic environment. A previously steady signature wavered, suggesting a course correction or depth change. It was not proof of hostile intent, but it was proof of awareness. Someone below had noticed they were being tested. At this stage, the encounter remained a contest of nerves. No weapons were released, but the choreography grew more complex. Maritime patrol aircraft operating at high altitude adjusted their orbits, ready to descend if needed. Helicopters lifted off, their presence more symbolic than aggressive. Flying patterns that boxed in large sections of ocean without directly revealing the strike group's center. To anyone listening underwater, the message was unmistakable. You are detected, and your freedom of movement is shrinking. The tension peaked when a brief but unmistakable acoustic anomaly cut through the noise. It lasted less than 3 seconds, too short to classify conclusively, but its frequency range matched known propulsion transients associated with rapid acceleration. In plain terms, something underwater had moved fast, very fast. Whether this was an evasive maneuver, a positioning run, or an intentional provocation remains debated. In the moment, it forced a recalculation. Rules of engagement allowed for defensive measures if an imminent threat could be established. The difficulty lay in defining imminent in an environment where visibility was measured in probabilities rather than certainty. The commander chose to escalate laterally rather than vertically. Additional assets were repositioned. Search patterns tightened. Sonobuoys were finally deployed, not in a dense field that would signal panic, but in a sparse, carefully spaced net designed to clarify the picture without revealing intent. What followed was the most intense phase of the encounter, the period later described in briefings as the longest hour that never officially existed. Contacts appeared and vanished, sometimes re-emerging miles from their last known position. This behavior suggested disciplined crews exploiting thermal layers and background noise with precision. At least once, analysts believed they were tracking two separate platforms coordinating their movements. At another moment, that same assessment was revised, attributed instead to a single vessel using deceptive routing. The truth may never be known. Throughout this phase, the carrier itself remained the quiet center of activity. Speed adjustments were subtle, but continuous. The ship's massive inertia masked these changes from casual observation, yet underwater they altered acoustic profiles enough to matter. Aircraft launches were delayed, not canceled, to reduce predictable noise. Even internal ship operations were modified to minimize unnecessary vibration. Thousands of small decisions accumulated into a single objective: deny the adversary clarity. The possibility of an actual attack was considered, but never confirmed. Some later accounts claimed a firing solution was briefly detected, only to dissolve before it could be acted upon. Others argued this was an analytical artifact, a pattern-seeking mind filling gaps under stress. What is documented is that countermeasures were prepared, armed, and then deliberately stood down. That choice alone speaks to how close the situation came to a point of no return. As time passed, the intensity did not explode. It drained. The underwater picture simplified. One by one, ambiguous contacts faded beyond effective tracking range. Sensors that had been saturated with data began returning to baseline. The helicopters recovered to their decks. Sonobuoy returns went quiet, offering nothing but the steady hiss of an empty sea. The final moments were the most unsettling. There was no confirmation of withdrawal, no clear indication of victory or defeat. The contacts simply ceased to matter, slipping into a zone where they could neither threaten nor be pursued without risk of escalation. For several minutes, the strike group maintained heightened readiness, waiting for the inevitable second act that never came. When normal operations gradually resumed, it was done without announcement. No alarms were sounded. No congratulatory messages were passed. The ocean around the formation appeared unchanged, betraying none of the tension it had held. To the outside world, nothing had happened. And yet, for those involved, the silence carried weight. It suggested intent without action, capability without use. Whether the encounter was a failed probe, a calculated demonstration, or a coincidence sharpened by imagination remains unresolved. What is certain is that during that window of time, control of the sea was contested not through fire, but through presence, perception, and restraint. In modern naval warfare, such moments are increasingly common and increasingly dangerous. They leave no wreckage, no headlines confirmed by officials, only traces in classified logs and memories of watchstanders who felt the ocean watching back. This encounter ended in quiet, but quiet does not mean peace. Sometimes, it is simply the sound of a line not yet crossed. When the encounter finally dissolved into stillness, it did so without ceremony. There was no clear signal that it was over, only the gradual absence of everything that had defined the preceding tension. Acoustic channels that had been dense with ambiguity returned to a flat, almost reassuring monotony. Systems remained active, crews stayed alert, but the sense of immediate confrontation faded into something harder to define. The sea did not announce resolution, it simply resumed its indifference. In the hours that followed, the carrier strike group maintained elevated readiness, operating on the assumption that silence could be temporary. Commanders are trained to distrust calm that arrives too neatly. Patrol patterns remained conservative, and decision-making stayed centralized. Yet as time passed with no reappearance of contacts, the reality became unavoidable. Whatever had unfolded beneath the surface had ended on its own terms. What made the aftermath unusual was not what happened, but what did not. There were no reports of damage, no emergency maneuvers, no visible changes to the formation that would indicate losses or near misses. From a material standpoint, the strike group appeared untouched. This absence of evidence became, paradoxically, the most unsettling detail. Modern naval engagements rarely leave no trace at all. Even exercises generate data, chatter, something tangible. Here, there was only inference. Internally, the event was dissected with meticulous care. Sensor logs were replayed repeatedly. Every maneuver, every system adjustment, every decision point was reviewed in isolation and then in sequence. Analysts compared timelines, tested alternative interpretations, and attempted to reconstruct intent from fragments. Some assessments leaned toward a calculated probe, designed to test responses without crossing a line. Others suggested a failed positioning attempt that withdrew once its window closed. A minority view held that the encounter may have been closer to escalation than anyone was comfortable admitting. Officially, nothing occurred. No statements were released. No acknowledgments were made beyond routine patrol updates. This restraint was deliberate. To confirm an incident would invite questions that could not be answered publicly without revealing capabilities or vulnerabilities. Silence in this context was not denial but strategy. Among the crews, however, the impact lingered. Sailors who had stood watch during the encounter carried a sharpened awareness into the following days. Procedures were followed more precisely. Small anomalies drew faster attention. The understanding that the ocean could suddenly become contested without warning had moved from theory to lived experience. That change, while intangible, mattered. The broader implication was clear to those tasked with long-term planning. Encounters like this represent a growing gray zone in naval operations, where presence substitutes for force and ambiguity becomes a tool. No shots fired does not mean no message delivered. On the contrary, restraint itself can be communicative, signaling capability, confidence, or caution, depending on perspective. For the carrier strike group, the patrol continued. Courses were adjusted, schedules resumed, and aircraft launched again under open skies. To an observer, the massive ship and its escorts looked unchanged, as if they had simply passed through another stretch of empty ocean. Only those who had listened closely knew that the water had not always been empty. In the end, the silence that followed the encounter became part of its meaning. It marked a boundary that had been approached but not crossed. A reminder that modern conflict does not always announce itself with fire and noise.